Well, thank you, Kevin. That was a great introduction. Hi, everyone. You actually hit some points that I'm going to talk about in more detail during my talk. I just finished my PhD at McGill at the Montreal Neurological Institute, and I'm also the chair of Brain Art, so here at OHBM. And I'm deeply interested and invested in science communication, specifically public outreach. So today I will be talking to you and bringing my own personal story on how I got started in public outreach, and I'll try and tie it together as to why it's important to do outreach. And the main message, and we're going to get to it at the end, is that there's no actually blueprint to do this. So if you're here, to get kind of a list of items and skills, unfortunately, I do not have that. So we can build it together. And the point is, you just learn by experience. You just have to get out there and do your own thing. And that will give meaning back to what you're doing in science. So, okay. So, how do I go back? Okay, whatever. Let's just start with a show of hands. How many in here do science communication? Okay. I would suggest you to think that everyone in this room is actually a science communicator. Whether you're a communicator of science within or outside of academia, that doesn't mean that you're not a science communicator. And this is because just, by being a scientist, you need to communicate your science. So you write papers, you attend conferences, you organize maybe courses or workshops, and that makes you a science communicator. Now, the problem, if that is, we can think of it a problem, is that most of the communication that we do as scientists actually happens within academia. And this is some stats from UNESCO. They're quite old, but I couldn't retrieve the latest updated, most recent numbers. But what this graph is showing is that scientists make up 0.1% of the world's population. And in the grand scheme of things, the question that we may ask ourselves is, how does science reach the 99.9%? So that's like a huge number, right? The rest of the population. And so if you think about it, most of our research and our science is actually paid by the public because it's publicly funded. And so it is as a duty of our duty as scientists to actually give back and lower this divide between science and academia. Now, you may have a counter-argument to this, which is, well, with this whole open science movement, science is available, the public could, go and download papers, but the fact that science is becoming more and more available doesn't mean that it's accessible. And in fact, I bet you, if your mom or grandmother or father downloaded one of your papers and started reading it, they probably wouldn't understand, right? And so the goal of public outreach in this context, which falls under the broader umbrella of science communication, is to really make science accessible. And this is, in the wider range of peoples, communities, languages, and that's topics that we're going to cover today. And the main reason why it's important is because there's a lot of public interest in science. And these are just some of the outlets that most of the population is interested in. And those come in like a variety of forms, whether it's written, oral, podcasting that we're going to hear later on. And so if we think of science as a huge puzzle that we're trying to build together, we can think of us as scientists as one piece of this larger puzzle. And what we're trying to do is really to bridge, and create this puzzle and put all these pieces together. And so community outreach or public outreach is trying to create this bridge between these two pieces. And if we think back to how we actually started, we can place ourselves in that blue puzzle piece because once we were part of the public. And so if I were to ask you, what made you or still makes you fall in love with science, I bet that most of you in this room would say, well, maybe I had, a teacher that made me fall in love with science. I was really interested in science because I read a specific book or I saw a movie. Or, I had a parent that is involved in science communication. And in my case, for instance, I remember very vividly One day at kindergarten, there was a father of one of the kids that is a neurologist and came and gave a talk about the brain. And my mom always says that from that day, I kept talking about the brain and I wanted to study the brain. But what's really interesting to me is that I place myself also in the public nowadays, despite considering myself as a scientist. And this is because the science that I study is very niche. We study neuroscience, but I'm interested in other aspects of science. And I cannot access, right, papers, for instance, in physics. And so what I do to learn other topics is I use, other physicists or other scientists that are engaging and involved in science communication, in this case, public outreach. And these are some of the ones that inspire me in learning physics. Okay, so the question you may ask is, okay, this is all cool, Giulia, but why is it important to engage the public? Well, most of the time we think of engaging the public from a public standpoint, right? Because we want to inform, especially in the area of misinformation, if we think about COVID. And so we want to build trust back in science. And also we want to educate. But the reason why I think it's also important to rethink of public outreach is to think through it through the eyes of us scientists. And this is because there is a bidirectional benefit in engaging with the public. And here I'm just going to highlight some of the reasons why, to me, it's important to do public outreach. One of this is because we need to increase representation in academia. And in fact, engaging with the public is a long-term investment in the diversity of science. In my case, for instance, I'm a woman, and I got told, unfortunately, many times that girls cannot do science. And we know that in academia, there's a huge problem, which is the gender gap. Now, I don't know why Australia and America are not included in this map, but it's a worldwide issue. And this is just my story, but everyone in here has a story, and we know that inclusivity and diversity are issues that are currently dealt with and people are trying to deal with in academia. And so if you are able to engage with the public, you serve in a way as a role model in your own demographic to try and lower this divide. And be a role model, show, in my case, those little girls that you can be a successful scientist and they can be one as well. So in a way, you're sowing the seeds for the future. Another point for me, at least, is the fact that as a new imager, especially when I started, I felt that what I was doing was really abstract. And so engaging with the public, in a way, was for me a medium to give kind of a concrete sense to what I was doing, because it's kind of easy as scientists to avoid or to lose sight of the general purpose. And so I got, many times the question from the public when I would, talk about my research: why are we doing this? Why are we putting tax dollars in this, in this topic? Especially in my case, I studied variance of the Bold signal, and they're like, what is this? Like, what are you talking about? Why should I learn about this topic? And so that's a challenge, and I think, the more you engage with the public, the more you're trying to understand what's the bigger picture to what you're doing. And another point that I want to raise, which probably it's something that people don't think about, is the role of public outreach ahead, so at the start, not at the end in terms of dissemination of findings, but actually involve the community at the beginning. And that could be forming new ideas. And this is because most of the time, when I engage in public outreach, I get questions from the public that are incredibly hard to answer because they're not experts as we are in our own topic. And this is an example of a little girl. So here I led a workshop on brain organization to kids in Montreal, and it was a 2-hour workshop, and we were building brains with clay and then creating neurons with pipe cleaners. And at the end of the workshop, I asked the kids to draw what they learned from the workshop. And this little kid just ran up to me, and she's like, "Giulia, look, I draw a cat pooping." And I was like, oh my God, like a cat pooping, 2 hours spent, talking about brain organization. And I thought, wow, either she's ahead of her time and thinking, of the brain-body axis, maybe she knows already what's up. But then she was like, well, this is the only thing I can draw right now, which was the cat pooping. But then next to it, she tried to actually copy the brain that we drew with clay. So that, to me, was like the highlight of that day, despite the funny bit, because it really, put into perspective the fact that these kids are really curious. They want to learn, and if you can convey to them your enthusiasm about the brain, then they're really trying to, kind of copy you in a way and imitate you, and potentially this could spark interest in, becoming a neuroscientist down the road. Woo. Little pause. I lost my mouse. Okay. And then the last bit, and this I'm sure I'm giving you an example for Canada, but I'm sure it extends outside of Canada, is the fact that public outreach and science communication nowadays is actually falling, or it's fitting within the scope of a lot of funding agencies. And in fact, in my case, for instance, when I was preparing my postdoc fellowship application, there was a section that was mandatory to fill out in terms of what is your social engagement, what are you doing for the community. And this is because funding agencies really want to promote more responsive research and engage stakeholders and the public ahead, informing, trying to design studies that meet the needs of the population and of the community in terms of, trying to become better decision makers and trying, to engage with the public and make science more accessible. Okay, but you may say, okay, those are all principles. How do we get to do it? How do we put all these ideas to practice? And as I said at the beginning, unfortunately, there's no blueprint. And this issue is compounded by the fact that in graduate school, there's no mandatory formal training for science communication. And that becomes a problem because we all know that we're overloaded with work to do, and most of the time, if not all the time, success in science is measured by productivity, and that is how many papers you publish, talks that you give, fellowships that you get, and so on and so forth. And so, what's the point? Why should I engage with the public? And despite, there not being formal training, there are some universities, and here I'm giving you the example of Mount Sinai in New York, if I can get it to work. And this is a paper that I recommend you read. So there are some groups that are trying to integrate science communication in graduate programs. But as we all know, this is just like a small amount, like a small set of researchers. So what should we do now? Should we just roll our thumbs and wait, the moment that science communication actually becomes mandatory? And the answer is no. And what I want you to convey in the second half of this talk is that if you're interested, and if you think that, like me, you should be engaging in science communication, you already have the skills, and you can start today. Okay, so we're gonna try and hit some questions. So one is, what are the skills that are needed? How do I get these skills? How do we get started? And what are some examples and areas of public outreach? And I thought, I could give you lists and answers to all these questions, although, as I said, I do not have all these answers, but it may be more relatable if I tell you my own story, and then, we can have a conversation if you have questions. And I do also have some activities as we go. Okay, so the way I got started in public outreach was actually I was a research assistant in Toronto. And if you think about being a research assistant, and maybe some of you were research assistants back in the day, you were actually a science communicator in being an RA. And this is because just by recruiting participants, you have to engage with the public. And many times you get questions from the participants themselves. And so that's a skill that you already have and you have built. And you can use that and channel it now to do public outreach. In my case, for instance, I was trying to recruit participants for a healthy aging study and also raise awareness for brain health and aging. And so I created this booth at BICRES, so at the Rotman Research Center, to try and communicate science to the public and get them this bidirectional benefit and trying to recruit them for the study. But then, I started graduate school in Montreal, and I thought, oh wow, how am I gonna do this? I'm overwhelmed. Do I have time for public outreach? And so I thought maybe the path of least resistance is to engage in public outreach via written communication. So instead of going out there and crave out time to set aside time to actually engage with the public in person, what I can do is set aside time whenever I want to write about science. And so that was what worked for me at the beginning. I was writing for Brain Post, which is a pretty read kind of science blog, and also for a more local blog post. And then, I thought, well, that's kind of dry. I don't know if I just want to be a science communicator, just summarizing research for the lay public. So then I started incorporating aspects of, more comedy or art and literature into my own pieces. And this is a piece that I wrote about, the pandemic and how I was missing Nonna's lasagna. I'm Italian, by the way. And so it was just like creating a list. It was a very silly piece, but I had a lot of fun with it. And then I started, talking more about incorporating more matters that, matter to me, and as I said, equity and inclusivity and diversity in my pieces as well. And then as I went along, I thought to myself, well, I still miss that, contact, person-to-person type of public outreach. And so I decided to go back to oral communication in my public outreach. And in that sense, what I thought, was maybe the easiest or entry point for public outreach is to join organizations and institutions that are around me and that are already engaging with the public. And so in that case, one example would be, you can reach out to the communications office at your own university or at your own institution, because there are people that are paid by your university and institution to engage in science communication with the public. And that's what I did at the Neuro and at McGill. And as part of OHBM, we have outreach with kids, and that's actually happening tomorrow, and also through Brain Art. Now I'm the chair of that interest group, and that's a way to include art or start a discourse between art and science and make science more accessible to the public. However, my imposter syndrome was like, okay, Giulia, but do you actually have these skills to do science communication? And so the question that was really daunting me was, should I be an expert in everything science to be able to talk to the public? What if, I'm up there talking about neuroscience, but somebody is asking me something about something else that I don't know? And so what was really an eye-opening experience to me was attending this workshop. So I sought out opportunities to get some formal training. So this is a workshop that I attended in Canada, but in the next slide, I'm gonna put it up, and there's a lot of resources for people all across the world. And what this workshop actually made me realize is that I already had all the skills I needed to do science communication, and we're gonna talk about it in a second, but also that you can shape your own mold. Because there's no blueprint, you can actually do it the way you want. So if you're not comfortable with interacting publicly with people, you can write blog posts. If you're not a great writer or you don't want to write, then you can actually talk, and have conversations with the public. And the way you can do it is, and I think this is an important point, is that you can, go above and beyond the English-centric perspective that we have in science, and so you can do it in your own language. And that's actually very important because that makes science more accessible to the wider world. And that's also because English-speaking people may not have the skills that you have, to get into another culture, another type of language. And these, I don't know, maybe I'll put it up at the end, but these are some resources that have helped me, and I found them across the world. And as I said, another thing is you can just join institutions or organizations around you. And one example is OHBM SIGs. Okay, so I just want to highlight, and that links very nicely with what Kevin was showing early on. This is the schedule of the workshop that I attended, some of it. And you can see that there are two things actually that I want to highlight. One is comedy night, and one is storytelling. If you think about it, when I think about science communication, before I attended this conference, I thought, to be a science communicator, I need to know what I'm doing. Why would I need to be funny? Why are we doing a science SciComm night? And what's the importance of telling a story? And those was actually the highlights of this workshop. And the reason for this is because the main way to really get to your public is to relate to them. And the way to relate to them is to make your science fun and accessible. And as Kevin introduced at the beginning, or said at the beginning, the art of stories and narration is actually the way you get them to them. And if you add, comedy and fun pieces to it, then I think, I don't know, it's just like the way that I do, and it's the most rewarding piece, because, you're simplifying your topic and trying, to engage in a conversation with them. And on that note, I do have a little game that we can play. This is just an example. So the point of this activity is to show you that we have these skills already. And so we're gonna try and create a story. This is an example of the dead salmon experiment in fMRI. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the reason why I picked this topic is because if you think about it, it could have or had a lot of public attention to it. And so in this example, it's a conversation between a kid and their parent, and we are the parents, and we need to describe to the kid in lay terms what this experiment is. And the goal is you cannot use, jargon, and you can only use accessible and simple language. You can add some fictional elements, especially if you don't fully remember the experiment. It's totally fine. So initially, the idea that I had here was to play it as a hot potato game, but maybe what's better is maybe we can split in pairs. And you can use, the dead salmon experiment or some other topic. It could be your research. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. And then if somebody wants to volunteer, we can do it together. Okay, let's do it.
Very briefly, I also want to mention that we have allowing questions and answers through the app. So if, as we go along, if you want to ask any questions, or afterward, if you want to ask some questions, please feel free, go in the app, go to the, audience response, and you can ask questions about any of these topics that we're going through. Sorry to interrupt. Continue.
Cool. Does anyone want to volunteer?
Feel free to just stand up, or there's a microphone here if you would like to be loud.
No volunteers. I can give you a squishy brain if you volunteer. No, actually, I have a squishy brain. No volunteers? You don't want a squishy brain? No?
So we haven't finished the story, but we narrowed
Okay.
it down to saying that the M in MRI stands for magic. And it's a machine that produces a picture, but sometimes it lies to you. And I think that's about all we got to.
Cute. Yes. Yeah, that's actually how you do it. That's great. See, you're a public outreach communicator. Perfect. Yeah, so that was an example of one way you can engage the public, and I hope you had fun with it. And that's, yeah, the art of storytelling, as Kevin introduced at the beginning. Okay, so what about, what are some areas that you can do public outreach in? And my piece of advice to you is, because we know we don't have much time, right, to engage with the public, the easiest way to do this is to just, find what you love doing outside of academia and use that to engage with the public. In my case, for instance, I love art. I engage a lot with kids and older adults, and I run a lot. And so through, these three hobbies that I have, that's how, I was able to engage with the public, and that's how I'm doing it so far. So find your passions and use your passions to engage with the public. And these are just some examples. For instance, I was able to organize an art exhibition on neuroimaging at one of the museums in Montreal. I was part of, a booth at the Science Center. That's communicating in Italian about neuroscience. I did a scavenger hunt with kids, and then that's where the poop cat is. It's right here. That was with the kids. And also another point that I want to make is, as I said, you can find your own medium of communication. It could be, videos. This was a video. It could be just, art. So you don't have to talk. You can just, show the art pieces. It could be games. But also it could be, if you're an artist yourself, you can just use art and, use more of a visual media of communication to engage with the public. And these are other points. So I was also part of a panel on science communication, and I engage with older adults. And these are older adults in the community in Montreal, because McGill, and I believe many universities around the world, promote intergenerational learning. So there is at McGill a chapter for older adults to still be students at the university. And so I basically reached out to them and asked if they wanted to, in this case, talk about, because this was during, just after COVID, if they wanted to talk about how, they were able to survive the pandemic and how they coped with social isolation. And that's an artist. So she was telling us about art and her own art gallery in Montreal and how she was able to get through COVID through drawing and painting. Okay, so I tried, because I knew this is an educational course, to put together actually a blueprint on how to do public outreach. And this is by no means comprehensive, but these are some of the points that I use in my own activities to try and successfully deliver science to the public. And I'm gonna go through them with one example, just to give you some background to each point. And one thing that I want to say is that you don't have to have all the ideas to do public outreach, because I'm sure maybe there's somebody in the audience that has some ideas on how to do outreach, but needs or is looking for somebody else that may want to help or do the activity with them. And that's something that came up a lot in my own journey in public outreach. You just team up with others, and it's not only making it more fun, but also easier to actually make it happen and have it have the activity actually happen. Okay, so I'm going to use, as an example, the activity that I did at the Science Center in Montreal to go through the blueprint. So the first thing that I did was I identified the topic and the reason why I wanted to outreach. And what I wanted to do was to communicate general neuroscience topics. In that case, it was just, what's the brain and how does it work? And I identified my target audience. I love kids, so I thought, let's start with children. And that probably was a mistake, because that's the hardest age group to actually target, because you really need to dial it back and go back to, to the really pillars of neuroscience. Okay, so then I thought, I needed to identify the medium of communication. What activities am I going to offer to the kids to actually teach them about the brain? And because they're kids, and I think adults too, I thought it has to be more of a fun game. And so that's where, I came up with the idea of the pipe cleaners to, create and put together neurons and teach them about, all the parts of the neuron, the axon, the dendrites, the nodes of Ranvier, and so on and so forth. And then we created brains with clay to talk about, the different lobes and the function of the lobes. I then prepared a card game where I made them associate parts of the brain through, pictures from MRIs to pictures in the world. So for instance, I'm going to give you an example. I had an MRI scan that was showing, or rather a conductivity scan from DTI. And then I created a metaphor with a city full of traffic with two lanes. One was full of cars, and one wasn't full of cars. And the idea here is that they needed to bridge, and say, okay, connectivity is, trying to link like a street, two places, and then, there are some areas that are more linked than other areas, and that hence, the part of the lane that has more cars with the lanes that has no cars. And then, once I had the activities, I thought, okay, I need to pitch this idea. I need to go to somebody and talk about it. And so I was kind of stuck because I didn't really know who to talk to. And then I thought an easy access or an easy way to do this is just to contact the communication office on my institution. And it turned out that the Neuro has every year a science fair booth at the Montreal Science Center. And that was, luckily enough, as a celebration of the International Day of Girls and Women in Science. So that ticked all my boxes. Also because before reaching out to the Neuro, I just cold emailed the Science Center. And I was like, okay, this could go terribly well or terribly wrong. And in fact, I didn't hear back. And I was like, okay, my idea was crap. This is never going to, work. And then it turned out that museums, and this is something to keep in mind, they plan their activities years ahead of time. So eventually they got back to me and they were like, Giulia, this idea is cool, but our program is all filled up until like 2030. And I was like, cool, I'm not gonna be in grad school and I'm not gonna be in Montreal in 2030. And so the Neuro then, as I said, had this, science fair booth, and so it all worked out. And as I said, I couldn't do these activities alone. And in fact, there was 6,000 kids that day. And so I found, volunteers and lab mates to help me with the activities, and it was very fun. At the end of the day, I couldn't even talk anymore, but I really recommend. It was very fun. And then, so then we contacted the museum, we made a plan, and we made it work. Okay, so if we want to summarize, and trying to respond to these questions, the skills that are needed are, need to be clear in the way you communicate, and I hope one of the things that, came through is that the more spontaneous you are in how you communicate your science, the better it is with the public. And you can use things like storytelling, comedy, to really get your message across, be creative. And if you are enthusiastic about what you're doing, then I think that's, an easy entry point for the public as well. And how do you get these skills? There are some free resources and workshops, but then I think the best way to get these skills is just do it. Learn through your experience, and if you have the opportunity to have mentors around you, then of course that could be a good thing to have. And then the last point: what are some areas of public outreach? As I said, if you can channel what you love doing in your science and in your public outreach activities, then you win the lottery because you're gonna have fun doing public outreach. And the entry point, the accessible entry point is actually to join a group, an organization. Then you can lead your own activities. But the easiest way is to just like tag along to get more experience in this space. Okay, so I just want to conclude, and you may wonder, what's this? Like, okay, you're Italian, but why do you have to show us, the Tower of Pisa? Okay, so I don't know if you know Magritte. He's a French artist. He actually had at a certain point in his artistic career a surrealism kind of wave. And in fact, this is a surrealistic piece because you have the Tower of Pisa that is leaning against this feather. And the metaphor that I want to create here is that we often think of science, and we as scientists, we perceive ourselves as a very structured piece, and that's like the Tower of Pisa. But in reality, we're leaning towards, we need support from something that is lighter, and is actually giving meaning. And in fact, in this realistic piece, the tower would fall if the feather wasn't there. And you can think of, the other part of science, and that is the communication, public outreach part, as, this piece that is giving meaning to what we're doing. And so in a way, is this discourse between, engaging with the public and giving back to that in terms of, creating an identity of science and a scientist that goes beyond just being at the lab and doing research. So with that, there's a lot of people to thank. I'm not going to go through the list. But as I said, it takes a village. And just as you do your own research in science, you're not doing it alone. And it's the same thing for public outreach. So here are some of the people that I would like to thank. And just as a plug, as I said, OHBM is trying to engage in science communication, so you can join SIGs and get involved in public outreach, either through the ComCom, Brain Art, and the DIC committees. And with that, I do want to end on another fun activity. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and brainstorm ideas on how we can do public outreach. So we're going to split the room into 3 groups. So one group is going to try and identify topics for public outreach. So it could be, talking about your science, engage in public debate, a general neuroscience topic, and so on and so forth. Another group is going to try to identify the target audience, and another group, some form of communication, or like what kind of activities. We're gonna hand out Post-its, Alfie. We're gonna hand out Post-its. I did buy very cute pens or pencils, but they don't have a tip, so those are useless. So if you have pens, just use your pen to write on the Post-its. I'm gonna give you 5 minutes, and then together, we're gonna use the wall at the back to mix and match these 3 questions to come up with like a whole, outline of examples of public outreach, if that makes sense. Okay, cool. Maybe we can do, how we're gonna split this? Okay, so this is 1, and that's 2 and 3? Okay, sure. Okay, so this is, you guys are gonna do, you folks are gonna do 1, this side, and then the rows, okay, wait. 1, 2, 3. The 3 rows at the back are going to do 2, and then the front is going to do 3. Yeah. So this side is going to try and identify a topic. Okay, so this side is going to identify a topic. And then the back of the room is going to identify an audience. So in one Post-it, you're going to, for instance, write kids, like age 6 to 15. And then one will be like older adults. And then one could be like athletes. So have like different option, 1 per Post-it. Because the idea is we're going to then gather all together these ideas and then stick Post-it at the back of the room and create different options of public outreach, if that makes sense. And then the front is going to have different medium of communication, so different activities. Is that clear? Yeah? Cool.
Okay, go ahead and stick your Post-its on the wall as you've written something.
Okay, cool. So we're gonna, if you can just stick whatever you have to the wall, and we're gonna wrap it up, but you can use it as an inspirational message, maybe idea, and you can just mix and match as you wish. Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank